Good evening, and thank you for slipping into Sleepy Kitchen with me. Tonight, we're stepping into ancient Greek food through one steady, living detail. Some olive trees believed to have been planted in ancient Greece are still producing fruit today, more than 2,000 years later. That single thought can widen the whole topic quickly, because Greek cooking leaned on foods that could last, travel, and come back to the table season after season. Oil that could be pressed and stored in sealed jars and amphorae. Grain that could be milled when you needed it. Wine that could be kept, carried, and shared. Fish preserved with salt. Herbs dried for later. Figs dried for sweetness. And legumes stored dry until a pot and a little heat could turn them into supper. Even the simplest meals followed the practical logic of the landscape. What the land could grow, what the sea could offer, and what hands could grind, press, salt, and dry into something dependable. If you'd like more nights like this, you can subscribe, or simply come back whenever you need a quiet place. For now, exhale the tension out of your shoulders and just listen. Let's begin. A helpful shorthand for ancient Greek eating is the Mediterranean triad: grains, olive oil, and wine. Together, they offered steady calories, a dependable fat, and a fermented drink that keeps, especially when paired with vegetables, fruit, pulses, and occasional animal foods. This shorthand is not the whole story, but it captures why so many meals could be built from ingredients that hold their value over time, survive transport, and can be portioned carefully without waste. It also hints at a simple truth about daily cooking. When the foundation is stable, small additions can feel like real variety. Grains were the steady base because they could be dried, stored, and moved. Bread, porridge, and simple grain dishes turn a harvest into meals that stretch. Even when breads differed by region or budget, grain foods were flexible. They could be plain for ordinary days, or improved with better flour, oil, herbs, and sweeteners when a household had more to spare. Olive oil often served as the default everyday fat, the role that butter or animal fat fills in other food traditions. A modest pour can add meaningful energy to bread, vegetables, and simple stews without changing the meal's basic ingredients. Because oil keeps far longer than most fresh foods, it stays dependable across seasons. It helps meals feel complete when the rest of the pantry is built from stored staples, dried goods, and whatever is in season. Oil is also easy to measure and ration, drop by drop, which matters when a household is stretching supplies from one market day to the next. Wine was common, but in many Greek settings, it was treated as something to be managed rather than taken straight for speed. Many descriptions mention mixing wine with water, so the drink lasted longer and its effects stayed steadier over time, even though strength could vary by household and occasion, and even though taste preferences differed. Diluting wine stretches the supply and softens the strength, so an evening can unfold at a calmer pace. Mixing also changes flavor and sharpness, so the drink can accompany food more gently. That helps explain why wine is so often described alongside rules of hospitality and good order. Despite the fame of grand feasts, a lot of daily eating likely leaned toward plant foods because plants store and move more predictably than fresh meat. Dried pulses and grains can sit for months, and when simmered, they become filling meals like thick soups or porridge. Those foods do not require much else to feel complete, especially with oil, herbs, and a little salt. Fresh meat is time-sensitive and costly to produce, so it makes sense that it appears more often in stories about festivals, communal feasts, and formal sacrifice than in routine suppers. Vegetables, wild greens, and fruit can expand the plate when they are available, but the steady backbone is the food that keeps. Greek geography shaped the menu because the land is a patchwork of rocky hills, small valleys, islands, and a long coastline, with rainfall that can be uneven from place to place. Tree crops can thrive on slopes that are difficult to plow, and grazing animals can turn rough ground into milk and occasional meat without needing broad pasture or lush grassland. Coastal access makes seafood practical for some communities, while inland areas lean more on foods that store well and travel without spoiling quickly, especially when summers are dry. Even short distances can matter when roads are slow and water is limited. So, local conditions often decide what feels ordinary at the table. Food and religion overlapped often, especially in public life, where shared meals could carry civic meaning. Libations, small pourings of wine or other liquids, appear repeatedly as offerings that mark respect, gratitude, or the opening of a formal occasion. Sometimes, it is a first portion set aside before people drink. At major sanctuaries and city festivals, sacrifice and feasting were linked, so food was not only nourishment, it was also a public language for obligation, generosity, and belonging, with portions and roles that people recognized. Greek moral writing often praised moderation, treating self-control at the table as part of good character. Advice about pacing drinks and avoiding overeating shows up alongside warnings that excess can blur judgment and disrupt community life. Restraint can sound like a form of respect for others in shared spaces, even when real lives were unequal and complicated. The ideal still shaped how people described proper behavior in households and public events, and it influenced what was considered admirable at a meal. Seen this way, food is not only fuel, it is also a daily rehearsal of values, practiced in small choices like portioning, patience, and pace. Preservation mattered because harvests are seasonal, but eating is daily, and households had to bridge long gaps. Drying, salting, fermenting, and careful storage work by making food harder for spoilage to take hold, whether by removing water, adding salt, or changing the environment so it keeps longer. Storage also includes simple protection from humidity, insects, and rodents, since losing a jar or sack could mean losing a week of meals. Checking stores becomes part of staying fed. Once preservation becomes routine, stored food turns into quiet resilience, a way to keep tomorrow from depending entirely on today's weather. Ancient Greek food was never one single standard table, because region, wealth, and occupation changed what was realistic. A sailor, a shepherd, and an urban craft worker could share familiar staples, yet still eat quite differently depending on pay, proximity to markets, and the demands of the day, including how much time they had to cook. Trade widened options, but it also highlighted inequality, since fine breads, imported luxuries, and plentiful animal foods cost more than simple staples that most people could count on. With that broad map in place, it makes sense to begin with the tree that anchored so much of the Greek pantry. Olive growing in the Greek world reaches back several millennia, and by the time classical writers were describing daily life, olives were already an established crop rather than a new experiment. Archaeology fits with that long runway. At Aegean sites from earlier periods, researchers have found crushing stones, press beds or pressing surfaces, and vessels suitable for storing and moving oil. In some regions, oil also appears in recognizable transport containers, which suggests it moved beyond the household into organized exchange. A tree crop only becomes truly everyday when the know-how is steady, from pruning branches and clearing suckers to noticing pests, protecting stored oil, and deciding when fruit is best for curing versus pressing. That long practice helps explain why olive products show up so often in accounts of trade, household supplies, and public life. And it sets the stage for how Greeks kept groves reliable year after year. Unlike annual grains, cultivated olives are usually kept consistent by propagation, not by planting fresh seeds and hoping the next tree matches the last one. Wild olives grew naturally around the Mediterranean, but cultivation depended on selecting better fruit and then keeping those traits from generation to generation. Olives grown from seed can vary widely in fruit size, bitterness, and oil yield, so growers have strong reasons to clone a reliable tree through cuttings or to graft a favored variety onto a sturdy rootstock. Grafting keeps the scion, the fruiting wood, true to type, while the rootstock can contribute toughness against drought, wind, and thin soil, which matters on rocky slopes. It is also a quiet kind of quality control because it lets a grove keep producing familiar olives instead of drifting into unpredictable mixes as the years pass. An olive tree is slow to reward patience, but it can keep returning that patience for a very long time. Many trees begin bearing after several years, yet steady, heavy production often takes a decade or more, and people often talk about 15 years or so for a grove to reach its strongest rhythm. Once established, olives can remain productive for centuries, partly because new shoots can rise from the base even when the trunk becomes hollow, storm-damaged, or burned. Even in good conditions, yields often rise and fall from year to year, which encourages long-term planning rather than expecting identical harvests every season. A tree with that kind of lifespan makes timing and careful handling feel like the real work behind the fruit. Olives turn land into stored value in a way that is easy to translate into numbers, because oil concentrates what the fruit holds. A common modern rule of thumb is that it can take several kilograms of olives to produce 1 liter of oil, often around 4 to 6, though the exact amount depends on variety, ripeness, and extraction efficiency. Older presses and older handling could shift the outcome, but the scale still helps you picture what pressing accomplishes. In plain terms, a heavy bag of fruit can become something closer to a wine bottle amount of oil, which is why pressing is where the harvest starts to look like a transportable supply. Greener fruit can produce oil with sharper, more herbal bitterness, while very ripe fruit often yields a softer oil, so yield and character move together. Some years and some trees produce far more than others, but a mature tree can yield tens of kilograms of fruit in a good season, which is why households and estates cared about grove health. Harvest timing in olive culture is less about one perfect moment and more about choosing a goal for the fruit. Earlier picked green olives tend to be firmer and are often destined for curing as table olives, while later fruit darkens through purple toward black as it ripens and can yield oil more readily. In much of Greece, harvesting commonly falls into late autumn and early winter, but local climate and elevation can shift that window by weeks. and some groves are picked in several passes rather than all at once. Waiting longer can bring higher oil yield, yet it can also mean softer fruit that bruises more easily or spoils faster if it sits too long before processing. Once that timing decision is made, the grove still needs a method to get the fruit down efficiently and with the right amount of gentleness. Because olive trees are perennial and can produce for so long, harvesting methods are often designed to protect the next season as much as to collect the current one. Hand picking is gentle but slow, and simple tools like small combs can speed work while keeping fruit reasonably intact. Cloths or nets spread under the tree help catch olives cleanly and reduce loss, especially on rocky ground where fruit would otherwise roll and bruise. Branch tapping or beating with poles is widely described in traditional practice, particularly when speed matters, but rough treatment can damage young shoots and reduce future yield. The method often reflects the end use, because fruit meant for oil can tolerate more bruising than fruit meant to be cured and served whole. When oil is the goal, speed after harvest also matters, since fruit that sits too long before pressing can develop off flavors. Fresh olives are unpleasant to eat straight from the tree, and the reason is chemistry rather than personal taste. The fruit contains bitter phenolic compounds, especially Old European, that make raw olives sharply astringent even when they look ripe and appealing. That bitterness is part of the plant's defense, and it is strong enough that ripe still does not mean edible. Much of this bitterness can move into water over time, which is why soaking and brining can gradually change an olive without needing to cut it apart. So the harvest only becomes food after a curing step manages those bitter compounds. Curing works by moving bitterness out of the olive and, in many methods, building flavor through controlled change over time. Soaking in water with repeated changes can leach bitter compounds gradually, while brining adds salt that draws out bitterness and supports fermentation that softens flavor and aroma. Dry salting dehydrates the fruit slightly as it cures, which changes texture as well as taste, and some traditions use alkaline solutions to speed the process, sometimes traditionally derived from ash, followed by a thorough rinse and a final brine. Because alkaline solutions can be caustic, this is best understood as a historical method rather than a casual, modern-at-home technique without tested guidance. Depending on the method and the olive, curing commonly takes weeks and sometimes months, which is why olives fit so naturally into a pantry mindset rather than a quick meal mindset. After that long wait, the fruit is stable enough to store and trade, which helps explain why olives carried more than just culinary importance. In Athens, olives were not only food, they were also civic symbols tied to land, law, and identity. Greek myth credits Athena with gifting the olive tree, and that story helped frame the tree as a marker of protection and prosperity rather than just another crop. Historically, Athenians treated certain sacred or publicly protected olive trees as special, and surviving references describe legal consequences for damaging them, which hints at how valuable groves were to the city's economy and self-image. Olive imagery also shows up in honors and festivals, including the famous use of olive wreaths to mark victory, which is a reminder that the tree could stand for excellence as well as sustenance. With fruit gathered and made ready, it becomes natural to ask how Greeks turned that harvest into oil through pressure, settling, and time. Pressing is not only a mechanical act, it is a sequence of choices about cleanliness, speed, and separation. The goal is to move from a perishable pile of fruit to a stable fat that can travel, portion, and weight. Crushing turns firm fruit into paste. Pressure releases oil and vegetation water together, and then patience helps them part ways. Once the mixture rests, heavier particles sink and clearer oil can be drawn off, and careful storage protects that work through the months ahead. This is where the grove becomes a pantry. Olive oil is revealed through separation. The oil already exists inside the olive before it is pressed, and the work is mainly about releasing it, collecting it cleanly, and letting it sort itself into layers. Many ripe olives hold a noticeable share of oil by weight, often somewhere in the mid-teens to mid-20s, and ripeness shifts both yield and character. A basket that feels heavy with fruit can become a much smaller volume of shelf-stable oil once water and solids are left behind. In modern terms, it often takes several kilograms of olives to make about a liter of oil. Oil is lighter than water, so the pressed liquid naturally forms layers as it rests. Clearer oil rises above darker, heavier vegetation water and sediment. Tiny droplets slowly merge into larger ones that separate more easily if the liquid is left undisturbed. That is why timing and care matter. Olives that sit too long, warm up, or get badly bruised can begin changing in ways that dull aroma and raise acidity. Clean equipment matters too. If paste and liquid pick up dirt, leaf bits, or old residue, the oil can taste heavier sooner. Even without modern temperature targets, the practical lesson stays steady. Fresh fruit, clean tools, and prompt processing protect the flavor the tree has already built. Crushing matters because whole olives resist pressure like small cushions. They will not release oil evenly unless their cells are broken across the whole batch. In Greek and wider Mediterranean practice, this often meant stone basins with heavy rollers, or rotary mills where a stone wheel turns in a circular trough and steadily grinds fruit into a thick paste. Often the pits are crushed along with the flesh. Hard fragments can help keep the paste from becoming a sealed, slippery sludge, and they can create tiny channels that let liquid move once pressure is applied. At the same time, too much fine pit powder can add harshness and cloud the oil. The goal is a consistent paste with leaves and stems kept out, so the press releases oil instead of grit, and so the paste does not overheat or spoil before it reaches the press bed. Pressing turns paste into a measurable flow. Many traditional systems use stacked layers so pressure could reach the paste evenly, and liquid could escape without being trapped. A common arrangement is paste packed into fiber mats or woven bags, set in a stack on a press bed, then compressed using weights, levers, or screw presses, depending on local tools and period. Stone channels or spouts guide the liquid into basins for collection. The first liquid that runs out is cloudy because it carries oil, vegetation water, and fine particles together. Pushing harder can force out more water along with more bitter plant dust and solids, so the pressman balances yield against cleanliness. Thin, even layers usually press more cleanly than thick lumps, so stacking is not just for convenience. It is part of controlling what comes out. Oil quality often reflects how gently the fruit and paste are handled, and how aggressively the press chases the last % of yield from the same material. Early, careful pressing from fresher fruit tends to produce cleaner oil for eating. There is less oxidation, fewer harsh solids mixed into the liquid, and the aroma stays brighter. Later pressings can extract more from the remaining paste, and warm water may be added to loosen the mixture and increase flow. The trade-off is that these later runs often taste heavier and keep less well. In many traditions, they are better suited to lamps, work uses, or cleaning mixtures than to finishing food. The practical idea is simple. More force and more heat can mean more yield, but it changes the kind of oil. Clarifying the press liquid is largely a matter of settling. Oil naturally floats above vegetation water and sediment when left undisturbed for hours, or even a couple of days. If a jar sits quietly, heavier particles sink, and the top layer clears. Clearer oil can be poured off or skimmed into a cleaner vessel, leaving sludge behind that would otherwise make the oil taste harsh sooner. This decanting can be repeated to improve clarity, as long as the bottom is not stirred back into the liquid. Keeping oil pleasant is also a matter of slowing rancidity. Rancidity is oil reacting with oxygen over time, creating sharp, old flavors. Reducing air contact, heat, and light helps oil stay gentler for longer, especially in warm climates. A household might let the first settling happen in a wider jar, then transfer clearer oil into narrower amphorae for keeping and transport. Seals mattered. Stoppers and plugs could be fitted and reinforced, sometimes with clay, wax, or resinous materials, to reduce leakage, protect the contents in transit, and slow constant reoxygenation at the surface. In food, olive oil acts as a flavor carrier because many aromatic compounds dissolve and spread better in fat than in water. Simple ingredients can taste more complete with very little added. A small drizzle can coat grains or legumes so they feel smoother and less sticky. It can help herbs distribute through a dish instead of staying concentrated in one bite, which matters when seasonings are used sparingly. Oil also pairs easily with acidity. Oil and vinegar can be shaken into a temporary emulsion that clings to vegetables and bread instead of separating immediately. The same idea supports simple marinades for fish or cheese. Those small effects, plus the mouthfeel oil adds, help explain how the same pantry staples can feel varied from day to day, even when the meal is mostly bread, beans, greens, and a careful spoon of oil. As a lamp fuel, olive oil provided steady light through a simple mechanism. A wick draws oil upward by capillary action from a small reservoir and feeds a controlled flame. A modest amount can burn for hours, though burn time depends on wick thickness, airflow, and lamp shape. One lamp might sip oil slowly, while another burns it faster with the same volume. Wicks could be made from plant fibers, such as linen or flax, and cleaner oil generally burns with less smoke and less odor than many animal fats. Small clay lamps were portable and refillable, and keeping light through the night could be routine in homes, workshops, and sanctuaries. Olive oil also mattered for body care because it softens skin and loosens grime in a way water alone does not, especially when dust, sweat, and smoke are part of ordinary life. Ancient writers describe athletes coating the body with oil and then scraping it off with a curved tool called a strigil, removing oil, sweat, and dust together as part of washing routines in gymnasia. Oil was also a common base for scented mixtures. Herbs, resins, and flowers can be steeped into it to create perfumes and ointments that store well and can be carried without spoiling quickly. Because scented oil can be portioned drop by drop, it could serve as a personal good, a gift, or an offering, tying grooming to wider social customs. Because oil stores well and travels better than fresh food, it became a tradable product that connected groves to ports, and ports to distant markets across the Mediterranean. It packs high value into less space than many bulky staples. Shipping amphorae were shaped for stacking, and their pointed bases could be braced in sand or racks on ships. Marks or stamps on recovered jars suggest organized commerce, ownership, taxation, and sometimes a recognizable place of origin. Athens is famous for awarding olive oil as prizes in Panathenaic amphorae, showing how oil could represent wealth and public honor at the same time, not just calories. In some contexts, oil also appears as a store of value in rents, fees, or temple inventories, and even the leftover press cake could still be useful as low-grade fuel or animal feed. With oil's role mapped out from press bed to table, lamp, bath, and ship's hold, it becomes easier to see why the other steady pillar of the Greek pantry, grain, mattered so much at the daily table. Barley was the everyday grain for many Greek households because it tolerates dry conditions and thinner soils better than many wheats. It is a hardy plant that can still form usable grain when rainfall is uneven and fields are rocky, which fits the patchwork landscape of much of Greece. That practicality matters because grain is not a side dish in this world. It is the dependable base that fills bellies when gardens fail, when fishing is poor, or when a household is stretching supplies from one market day to the next. Once barley becomes the default, the rest of the meal often looks like additions to it, rather than the other way around. A pot of grain, a handful of greens, and a little oil can carry a family through heat and hard weeks. And the grain is what makes the whole plate feel steady. Wheat had a different reputation. When it is milled well and baked with care, it tends to make softer, lighter bread, and that texture could carry its own quiet prestige. Wheat can also be more demanding about water and richer land, so in many places it was more expensive and less predictable than barley. In larger cities, grain supply could turn into politics because dense populations could not always grow enough close to home. In some periods, Athens relied on imported grain to help steady prices and prevent shortages. Sea routes made bulk grain easier to move than hauling it overland, and shipments could come from multiple regions over time, including areas around the Black Sea and other grain-producing coasts. That dependence helps explain why grain laws, storage, and shipping appear so often in discussions of civic stability. When a city's routine relies on ships and seasons, the grain jar is never just a kitchen matter. Turning grain into edible food usually required grinding, and that work set the pace of daily eating more than many modern listeners expect. A common household tool was the quern, two stones that crush grain by rubbing. This turns hard kernels into meal by steady pressure rather than sharp cutting, and it is slow, repetitive work that can fill the quiet space between other tasks. Even if a household only needs a few handfuls of meal, the effort is real because each kernel has to be broken down. The stones also have to be kept clean and true, so they do not shed grit into the flour, and the meal has to be watched so it does not turn uneven. When grinding is slow, foods that tolerate coarse meal become more attractive because they let people eat well without chasing perfect fineness every day. Flour quality was not just about taste. It was also about how much labor and loss a household could afford. Sifting or bolting meal through cloth separates finer flour from bran and larger pieces, but it reduces yield because some mass stays in the coarser fraction. A family can choose refinement, or it can choose volume, and the choice shows up at the table. Whiter, finer flour could carry higher status because it required more grain, more work, or both. Darker breads and porridges used more of the whole kernel and stretched supplies further. This is one reason ancient descriptions can treat bread as a marker of class, since the same field can feed more people when the grain is used more completely. A staple barley food called maza was flexible enough to fit both scarcity and routine, especially when made from roasted barley meal that stores well. Roasting dries the grain and deepens flavor, and once it is ground, the meal can be kept ready for use in a jar or sack. With more water, it can become a thick porridge that is filling and plain. With less water, it can be mixed into a simple cake or into a firmer mass shaped and carried. In plain terms, it is a grain base that does not require delicate baking skill, and it still pairs well with oil, herbs, onions, or a bit of cheese when those are available. When the pantry is built around reliable grains, adaptable forms like this are what let meals stay steady without feeling identical day after day. Leavened bread depends on fermentation, and Greeks could achieve it without packaged yeast by saving a bit of old dough or keeping a naturally active starter. Wild yeast and bacteria live on grain and in the environment, and when flour and water sit together, they can become active enough to raise dough, especially when a portion is carried from one batch into the next. Not every household would leaven every loaf, and dense cakes and porridges remained common, but fermentation offered a useful option when time, fuel, and ingredients allowed it. It changes texture, making bread lighter than dense cakes of unmatured dough, and it can improve keeping quality by shifting acidity and moisture. In a warm climate, even a small change in acidity can make the difference between bread that stays pleasant and bread that turns stale or sour too quickly. Leavening is not only about height, it is also about making repeated grain meals feel more satisfying. Despite the word bread sounding singular, Greek baking methods were varied because households had to work with different fuels, tools, and spaces. Some breads could be baked in clay ovens that hold heat after the fire is raked out. Others were cooked under a cover that traps hot air and embers, or on heated surfaces that work like griddles. Covered baking can be efficient because it concentrates heat around the dough without needing a roaring fire for long. It can also be done with simple equipment once the coals are ready. When fuel is wood or charcoal, efficiency becomes part of technique. So the most practical breads are often the ones that bake reliably without wasting heat. The same dough can be shaped thicker for a covered bake, thinner for a hot surface, depending on the day. Bread also functioned as an eating tool, not just as a finished item on a plate, because it can carry and scoop softer foods. A firm piece can pinch olives, pick up beans, or gather sauces, and it saves the need for extra utensils in everyday settings. Even when spoons exist for soups and porridges, bread can still do the work of lifting, wiping, and portioning. It turns small amounts of flavorful foods into a fuller meal by spreading them across more bites. So a little cheese, a few herbs, or a careful spoon of oil can travel farther. Dipping can soften coarse textures and make stored staples feel fresher, and it can turn the bottom of a bowl into the next mouthful. Grain storage was a quiet technology of survival, and it required controlling moisture and pests more than creating perfect containers. Large clay vessels, baskets, and storage bins could keep grain dry when placed carefully, and many practices aim to raise food off damp ground, keep it sealed from insects, and protect it from sudden humidity. Spoilage in grain often starts invisibly, since mold and insects can turn a storehouse problem into a hunger problem long before a household notices the loss by weight alone. Checking stores becomes part of staying fed. And cleaning up spills matters because spilled grain attracts the very pests that threaten the rest. When storage is done well, grain becomes a kind of calendar, letting a household eat today without borrowing from tomorrow's planting. The most useful way to think about Greek grains is that they were not simply ingredients. They were the system that made everything else possible. Barley, wheat, and their different forms shaped how often people could afford cheese, fish, meat, or sweets, because those foods become easier to add when base calories are already secure. Once you see grain as the steady floor under the whole diet, it becomes natural to look at the next pillar. Wine too is made, mixed, and carried into daily life with its own rules and rituals, and it brings another kind of stability to the table. Grapevines fit the Greek landscape well, because vines can thrive on slopes and stony ground where many other crops struggle, and they can handle long sunny seasons when roots reach deep. Wine was not a single uniform product across the Greek world, because soil, elevation, island winds, and local grape varieties shaped flavor and strength even before any technique was applied. In practical terms, even nearby communities could produce wines that tasted noticeably different, simply because one faced the sea and the other sat higher and cooler, or because one valley held moisture longer while another dried quickly. That regional variation meant wine could become a marker of origin and reputation, not just a drink, which sets up why production and storage details mattered so much. Harvest and crushing were the first big quality decisions, because grapes begin changing quickly once picked, and damaged fruit can push fermentation in messy directions. Grapes were often gathered in late summer or early autumn, then crushed by foot or pressed, depending on local custom and the style of wine being made. The goal was to release juice while avoiding too much harshness from stems and seeds, since bitterness can dominate when the wine is simple and young. Even without modern lab terms, growers understood that sound fruit, clean containers, and steady timing made a more stable result. Once juice is collected, the next problem is not flavor, it is control, because fermentation starts on its own. Fermentation happens when yeast consumes sugar and produces alcohol and carbon dioxide, and the process does not require added yeast to begin, because wild yeast lives on grape skins and in the environment. Once crushed grapes and juice sit, yeast can start working quickly. The same natural process can be calm or chaotic, depending on temperature, cleanliness, and how much broken fruit is in the mix. If fermentation runs too hot, aromas can fade and sharper notes can grow stronger. If it runs too cool, it can slow down and leave sweetness behind. The practical challenge is to let the change happen, but not let it run away, because grape juice is fragile until alcohol begins to protect it. Greek sources and archaeology point to large clay containers as common fermentation and storage vessels, including big jars that could hold far more than a household's daily needs. Many of these jars were kept partly buried, which helps reduce temperature swings and keeps the wine in a steadier range. Cooler, steadier temperatures make fermentation less unruly and less likely to spoil. Clay is also slightly porous, so sealing and cleanliness mattered, and some vessels were sometimes treated or lined to reduce seepage and stray flavors. Once fermentation finishes, the wine is more stable than grape juice, but it is still sensitive to air, heat, and contamination. which is why storage practices became part of the craft. Wine also had to travel across time as well as space. A jar that leaks, breathes too freely, or picks up mold in a warm storeroom can ruin a season's work. Keeping wine away from heat and strong light helps it stay calmer. Keeping air contact low helps slow the drift toward sharp, tired flavors. In practice, this can mean sealing mouths well, storing vessels in cooler places, and moving wine carefully so sediment stays behind when the clearer part is transferred. Wine can also throw sediment as it rests, so careful transferring is a kind of gentle sorting, leaving heavier matter behind. Small choices, like how quickly the new wine is sealed and how clean the tools are, can decide whether the drink stays pleasant through the months ahead. Although modern drinkers often imagine wine served straight from the vessel, many Greek texts treat unmixed wine as improper in ordinary social settings. The idea was not that wine itself was shameful, but that drinking it at full strength could lead too quickly to loss of judgment, conflict, or embarrassment, especially in gatherings meant to stay orderly. In plain language, dilution functioned like built-in pace control, keeping a cup from becoming a shortcut to intoxication. It also stretched supply, which matters in any economy where fermentation takes time and vineyards take land. Once dilution is the norm, the right way to drink becomes a social rule, not just a private preference. Wine-to-water ratios varied, and the key point is that there was no single fixed standard that applied everywhere. Many writers describe mixtures that range from fairly strong to quite light. A common anchor is several parts water to 1 part wine, often 3 or 4 parts water, with stronger mixes appearing by occasion, age, and the tone of the gathering. This kind of mixing changes not only strength, but also how the drink pairs with food, since a lighter cup can sit beside bread, olives, and salted fish without overwhelming them. It can also soften a sharp young wine, especially when the wine is rustic and not aged for long. With ratio as a choice, the act of mixing becomes part of the shared meal rhythm. The crater mattered because it made dilution communal instead of private. Rather than each person adjusting their cup, wine and water could be blended in a large bowl and then ladled out, which creates a shared standard of strength for the group. This also helps explain why serving tools appear alongside drinking vessels in the material record, because transferring and portioning were built into the practice. When a group drinks from a common mix, it is easier to notice who is rushing, who is lagging, and who is staying steady, so the bowl quietly supports social balance. From there, cups and jugs become more than tableware. They become instruments for pacing and fairness. At a symposium, the famous after-dinner drinking gathering, diluted wine was used as a structured social activity rather than a background drink. Men often reclined, listened to music, spoke, debated, told stories, and played games, and wine was part of that system, meant to loosen the tongue without breaking the social fabric. Many accounts mention a leader, sometimes called a symposiarch, who decided the strength of the mix and the pace of rounds, not to control people as a harsh rule, but to keep the gathering from sliding into disorder. In that setting, dilution is not a compromise. It is the condition that allows conversation to remain intelligible across hours. Once wine is treated as a paced practice, it becomes easier to see why different flavors and additives were also carefully chosen. Despite the simple image of grape juice turning into wine, Greek wine could be adjusted in ways that make sense for preservation and taste. Writers mention adding honey to create sweeter styles, which increases sugar and can change mouthfeel. They also mention herbs and aromatics that act like early flavoring agents. Resin is especially notable in some traditions, since it can help seal containers, and it leaves a distinctive taste, a practice that connects to later resin-flavored wine in parts of Greece. Some traditions also mention seawater or brine additions in certain contexts, though these appear as regional choices rather than a universal habit, and they may be linked to preservation or a particular local style. The broader point is that additives were tools for stability, transport, and recognizable character, not random novelty. Wine had a ritual presence that shows up again and again, especially through libations, small pours offered before drinking or at key moments of a meal. A libation is not meant to quench thirst. It is a symbolic portion set aside, a way of marking respect and connection to the divine, to household customs, or to the occasion itself. This helps explain why wine appears in religious scenes and civic festivals, as well as private homes, because the same liquid can function as food, offering, and social glue. When a drink can play all three roles, it is easier to understand why vineyards, jars, and shipping routes mattered far beyond taste. With wine's patterns in place, it becomes natural to move from the cup to the foods that often sat beside it, especially the cheeses and dairy products built for travel and storage. Sheep and goats supplied most of the everyday milk in many Greek regions because these animals fit rocky grazing land and uneven pasture better than large herds of cattle. Goats can browse shrubs and tough plants that would not feed cows well, and sheep can turn sparse grass into milk, even when fields are better used for grain. This makes dairy less dependent on rich farmland, which matters in landscapes where good soil is limited and carefully prioritized. It also means herds can be moved along stony slopes and scrubby hillsides, while the best fields remain protected for barley and wheat. When animal choices match terrain, the milk that becomes common also shapes the cheese that becomes common. Cheese begins when milk is separated into curds and whey, and that split is a simple way to make a perishable liquid into a food that can last. Warm milk is set with a coagulant so proteins clump together into curds. Then the curds are gathered and drained while the watery whey runs off. The basic chemistry is the same across many cultures, yet the practical outcome depends on how much moisture is left in the curd, because wetter curds spoil quickly while drier curds keep longer. Even without modern measuring tools, a maker can control texture by cutting curds smaller, draining longer, and pressing more firmly. Once curds are formed, the next big decision is what to use as the coagulant. Not all coagulating agents were the same, but rennet, an enzyme-rich material taken from the stomach lining of a young ruminant, was a common and effective option. Rennet sets milk efficiently and helps create firm curds, which is useful when the goal is a cheese that can be salted and stored, rather than a soft curd meant to be eaten immediately. Plant-based coagulants also existed in Mediterranean traditions, and some ancient references mention fig sap as a curdling agent, though its use likely varied by region and by what a household had on hand. The important point is that curdling was achievable without industrial additives, using accessible biological materials. From there, the maker is essentially deciding how long the cheese needs to last. Fresh cheeses were soft, mild, and short-lived because they hold more water, and microbes grow best where water is available. When a cheese is eaten within days, the priority is quick draining and clean handling rather than deep aging. And the texture stays tender, spreadable, or crumbly rather than hard. A fresh cheese 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒 can still be filling because dairy concentrates fat and protein, but it is not built for travel unless it is protected in some way. In warm weather, especially, fresh dairy has a narrow window, which makes longer-lasting forms attractive to anyone who needs portable food. That need for durability is where salt becomes a central tool. Salt is the simplest and most powerful lever for cheese preservation because it pulls moisture out and slows the growth of spoilage organisms. Salting the curd directly seasons the cheese and leaves less free water for microbes to use. Salt can also be applied by rubbing the surface or by soaking the cheese in brine, depending on whether the maker wants a drier rind or a cheese that stays moist inside. These methods turn a short-lived food into something that can last weeks or months, which makes it useful for shepherds, travelers, and markets that cannot rely on immediate consumption. Once salt is in the system, the question becomes how much drying or aging the cheese should undergo. Aged cheeses get harder, largely because they lose water over time, and that dryness is what makes them so durable. Drying in moving air and keeping cheeses in cool, shaded places helps moisture leave gradually without encouraging spoilage, and the surface can develop a rind that protects the interior. Hard cheeses can be carried without leaking, sliced into thin pieces, or grated into small amounts that flavor a much larger dish, which makes them efficient in a pantry economy. In everyday terms, a hard cheese lets a household turn a small stored item into many meals by shaving off a little at a time. That efficiency is one reason aged cheeses appear so often in discussions of travel rations and provisioning. Brined cheeses represent a different preservation strategy, keeping the cheese submerged so the salty liquid guards the surface and discourages unwanted growth. In brine, the cheese can remain moist and crumbly while still lasting far longer than a fresh curd left in open air. It is common for brined cheeses to become tangier over time as microorganisms slowly change the flavor, and the brine itself becomes a stable environment once it reaches the right saltiness. The term feta is modern, but the idea of salted brined white cheese from sheep or goat milk has deep roots in the region, so it is safer to describe it as a feta-style form rather than a named ancient product. Brining also makes storage predictable because the cheese can be kept in a sealed jar with less concern about drying out. Whey was not necessarily waste because it still contains nutrients and can be used in simple secondary foods. If whey is heated and acidified, remaining proteins can coagulate into a soft curd, producing a mild cheese that is often eaten fresh, which is a way to extract more food from the same milk. Whey can also be used as a cooking liquid to add richness to grains or to soften legumes as they simmer, depending on household needs. Whey can also be fed to animals, depending on what a household is trying to stretch and what it needs most. In a world where milk is valuable, using byproducts is a form of thrift. And thrift is a practical kind of skill. Once whey is treated as useful, the whole dairy process becomes less about a single product and more about a chain of foods. Butter existed, but olive oil often filled the everyday cooking fat role in many Greek settings, which likely reduced butter's centrality compared with northern dairy cultures. Turning milk into butter requires churning and often benefits from cooler temperatures, And butter also has a shorter shelf life unless it is clarified or salted heavily. That does not make butter absent. It just makes it easier to understand why texts and imagery talk about oil so often as the default fat. When one fat is abundant and stores well, it naturally becomes the standard for cooking, lamp fuel, and preservation. This sets up why dairy tended to appear more often as cheese, a form designed to keep rather than as a daily glass of milk. Fresh milk spoils quickly in heat, which is one reason fermented milk products are practical in warm climates. Fermentation turns lactose into acids that slow spoilage and change texture, producing foods that keep longer and travel better than raw milk. The exact forms and names varied, and it is safer to speak broadly rather than insist on modern categories like yogurt in every household. But the core idea is stable, that sour milk products are more durable than sweet milk. When fermentation becomes normal, milk shifts from a fragile liquid into a more dependable set of foods. Cheese is also dense fuel because it concentrates calories into a small volume that is easy to portion. A couple of ounces can add meaningful energy and protein to bread and olives, and it can turn a simple bowl of beans or greens into a fuller meal without adding much cooking time. It stores, it travels, and it can be eaten without preparation, which makes it a reliable companion to the basic staples of grain and oil. From there, it makes sense to look toward another reliable companion on Greek tables: seafood, and the ways coast and trade shaped what people could catch, keep, and eat. Fish showed up often in Greek food because the coastline is long and jagged, and many communities lived close enough to the sea to treat it as a daily larder rather than a distant boundary. Even for inland towns, fish could still appear through trade, especially in preserved forms that travel better than fresh meat. Compared with livestock, the sea can provide protein without needing pasture or grain feed, which matters where farmland is precious and carefully assigned to staples. Many people still ate mostly bread, beans, and olives, but seafood could be a practical extra that did not compete with grain fields. Coastal households could eat part of the catch fresh, while inland households leaned more on salted, dried, and fermented products that keep their value on the road. Freshwater fish from rivers and lakes could add occasional variety too, though the sea remained the larger pantry for many communities. Once you accept seafood as an everyday answer to geography, it becomes easier to see why markets, methods, and preservation mattered so much. Fishing methods were varied because different waters and different species require different approaches. Nets can take schooling fish efficiently, and a good net day might bring many small fish at once. Hooks and lines work well for targeted catches, and they suit rocky shorelines where nets can snag or tear. Traps can sit in shallow water and collect fish with little ongoing labor once placed, though they still need watching, clearing, and repair. Spears and harpoons appear in images and descriptions too, especially for larger fish or for shoreline work where visibility is good. Each tool reflects an everyday trade-off between effort, risk, and reliability, because a household wants steady food more than a single dramatic catch. Those choices also shape what ends up in the kitchen, since a net harvest might bring many small fish, while a line might bring fewer, larger ones. Skill matters too, because reading currents, winds, and seasons can be as important as the tool itself. Fresh fish is time sensitive, and in warm weather, it can turn quickly, which is why the distance between boat and buyer affects who gets the best catch. A person living near the harbor can eat fish that tastes clean and mild, while a person farther inland is more likely to buy fish that has been salted, dried, or otherwise stabilized for travel. This also helps explain why fish markets mattered, because a market concentrates buyers and speeds turnover. Faster turnover protects quality and lets fishermen sell before the catch declines. Price would naturally rise with size, freshness, and desirability. So fish becomes not only food, but also a small lesson in supply and timing. A crowd at the stalls means decisions are quick. Buy now, cook soon, or choose a form that can wait. Despite the wide range of species, common preparations tended to be direct, because fish cooks quickly and does not need a long transformation to be satisfying. Grilling over coals is efficient and preserves flavor, and it fits a world where fuel matters. Baking in covered pots can protect moisture and keep small fish from drying out, especially when the fire is steady rather than fierce. Frying in olive oil can crisp surfaces while keeping the interior tender, and it can make delicate fish easier to handle and share. Salt is a key seasoning, not only for taste but because it draws surface moisture and helps the fish hold texture as it cooks. Herbs and acidic dressings can brighten rich fish, yet the core pattern remains simple because the sea already provides a strong flavor base. Once fish is cooked simply, the bigger challenge becomes keeping it when it cannot be eaten the same day. Salting and drying are practical answers to fish spoilage because they remove the conditions that bacteria need to multiply. Heavy salting pulls water out of the flesh and creates an environment where many spoilage organisms struggle, and drying then reduces moisture even further, turning fish into a stable, portable food. Preserved fish can be carried inland, stored for winter, and used in different ways depending on need. In some meals, it is eaten as a side or even a main portion, especially when a household wants a reliable food that needs little preparation. In other meals, it is used in smaller amounts to add salty depth to grains and legumes, stretching the value of a catch across many plates. In everyday terms, a little dried fish can function like seasoning and protein at the same time. That dual role is why preserved seafood becomes a bridge between coast and interior. Fermented fish sauces appear in Greek sources as well, often described as salty liquids made by layering fish parts with salt and allowing them to break down over time. In Greek contexts, the name is often given as gyros, and it likely varied by region and recipe rather than being one standard product everywhere. The process works because very high salt levels help suppress many dangerous microbes, while enzymes and thyme create a concentrated savory liquid that can be strained and stored. The result functions like a powerful seasoning, adding umami and saltiness to simple foods that might otherwise taste flat. When a seasoning is that concentrated, it becomes a small luxury in daily cooking, even if it is made from scraps. A spoonful can change a pot of beans. A few drops can wake up a bowl of greens. It is a reminder that preservation is not only about keeping food safe, it is also about making stored food taste alive. Shellfish offered another route to seafood because they can be gathered in shallow water without boats, especially in rocky coves and rocky shallows. Mussels, clams, and oysters can be collected by hand or with simple tools, and their shells protect the meat until cooking. Shellfish spoil quickly once dead, so they are best cooked soon after harvesting, which again links seafood to proximity and timing. Boiling or steaming opens shells efficiently and keeps the meat tender. Grilling can add smoky flavor when fuel is available and the fire is already lit for bread or fish. Because shellfish are strongly tied to place, they also create a sense of regional eating, where one shoreline can have common foods that another lacks. A sheltered bay can produce a different routine than a windswept coast. Octopus is naturally firm, and without tenderizing it, can stay chewy even after cooking, which is why traditional handling methods focus on breaking down texture. Repeated pounding, stretching, or rubbing can help disrupt muscle fibers, and slow cooking can then soften the meat further, especially when combined with boiling before grilling. The familiar image of beating octopus against rocks is one traditional approach, and the underlying idea is practical rather than theatrical, making a tough food easier to eat. Once tenderized, octopus takes flavor well from oil, vinegar, and herbs, fitting easily into the Greek pantry palate. This is a good example of how technique turns a difficult ingredient into a routine food. When the method is known, the sea's strange creatures become ordinary dinner. Fish trade connected communities because preserved seafood could move along roads and sea routes much more safely than fresh fish could. Amphorae and other containers helped carry salted fish and sauces, and a stable product creates predictable commerce, since it can be shipped and sold without being defeated by time first. For inland households, preserved fish offered a taste of the sea and a reliable boost of protein and salt when fresh seafood was impossible. For coastal producers, it created value from surplus catches that could not be sold fresh quickly enough. Preservation turns a single morning's catch into weeks of meals, and it turns local abundance into something that can travel. With seafood mapped out, it becomes natural to look at the other major protein story, meat, and why it appears less often in daily routine, yet looms large in festivals and public feasts. Meat in much of the Greek world was less routine than bread, beans, and oil, because keeping livestock costs grain, space, and labor, and slaughter also ends a long-term asset. Even when animals were common, a household could benefit more from milk, wool, traction, or breeding than from eating meat on an ordinary day. A goat that gives milk, or a sheep that grows wool, supports the pantry again and again, while slaughter ends that steady return. That is why many descriptions connect meat to special occasions, especially public festivals and communal feasts, where a single animal could feed many people at once. Preservation helped, but the simplest way to keep meat from wasting was often to share it quickly. In simple terms, meat tends to appear when the social calendar makes it efficient and meaningful, not just when someone feels hungry. Goats and sheep were well suited to Greek terrain, so they were frequent sources of both dairy and meat. They can graze on rough hillsides where crops would fail, and they convert scrubby vegetation into calories in a way that fits rocky landscapes. Pigs were also important because they grow quickly and can eat a wide range of foods, including household scraps, which makes them practical in settled communities. Each animal choice reflects a different efficiency. Goats and sheep match slopes and drought, while pigs match household waste and faster turnover. Herds can also be moved as needed, shifting grazing to meet the season without putting the best soil at risk. Once animals are part of the system, the question becomes when and how they are actually turned into meat. Public sacrifice and festival feasting shaped meat distribution, and ancient writers repeatedly link certain meals to religious settings. The idea was not simply killing for food, but offering a portion to the gods, and then sharing the rest among people in a structured way. Many descriptions emphasize that bones and fat were burned for the gods, while edible meat was cooked for the community. Though the exact details varied by city, sanctuary, and occasion. This kind of ritual creates a predictable moment when ordinary people might get meat, even if they could not afford frequent private slaughter. It also ties meat to memory, because a rare food becomes linked to a particular day, place, and shared event. Even the rules around who receives which portion can turn a meal into something the whole crowd recognizes. Roasting on spits was a common way to cook sacrificial meat because it is scalable, direct, and works well outdoors. A whole animal, or large cuts, can be turned over coals, and dripping fat adds flavor while the surface browns quickly. This method also makes portioning straightforward, since cooked meat can be carved and divided, and different cuts can be assigned to different groups or roles. Roasting is fuel-intensive, but festival settings gather enough wood, labor, and attention to make it practical. The cook can watch the surface change in real time, turning and shifting pieces to keep them from scorching. When the crowd is large, roasting becomes not just cooking, but an organized service. Boiling and stewing also mattered, because they use fuel efficiently and can turn tougher cuts into tender food over time. Large bronze or clay cauldrons can hold many portions, and simmering allows connective tissue to soften, making older animals and less tender parts enjoyable. A stew also accepts grains and legumes, which stretches meat across more bowls, turning a small amount of animal protein into a meal that feeds many. In everyday terms, boiling is a thrift technique that turns difficult ingredients into reliable nourishment. The broth itself becomes part of the value, carrying salt and fat into every spoonful. A pot can be kept at a steady simmer with fewer coals than a long roast, which matters when fuel is work. Sausages and stuffed foods are efficient because they use trimmings and fat that might otherwise be wasted, and they allow seasoning to be distributed evenly through the meat. By chopping meat fine, mixing it with herbs, salt, and sometimes grain or bread, then packing it into a casing, a cook can turn irregular bits into uniform portions. Casings often came from cleaned intestines, which is a practical use of an animal part that otherwise has no obvious role in the kitchen. Sausages can also be cooked quickly compared with large roasts, making them flexible for smaller gatherings and urban meals. Minced mixtures also soften differences between cuts, so tough scraps can become pleasant when they are well seasoned. Once you see sausage as thrift plus convenience, it becomes clear why it appears in comedy and everyday references, not only in grand feasts. Blood-based preparations exist in many food cultures because blood is nutritious and spoils quickly, so using it immediately prevents waste. Ancient references suggest that blood could be cooked in stuffed or bound dishes, turning a perishable liquid into something edible within hours. The key is heat and seasoning, since cooking coagulates blood proteins and salt helps stabilize flavor. In some cases, the blood could be combined with other foods on hand to give it body and make it easier to handle. But the purpose is practical, not showy. This kind of dish also highlights why slaughter days were busy, because many products had to be processed before they spoiled. When the whole animal is precious, using more of it is a quiet kind of skill. Despite chickens being familiar animals, eggs were often the steadier benefit, since a hen can provide food repeatedly without being killed. That makes poultry a small household asset, especially for people who cannot afford frequent meat purchases. Chickens were eaten sometimes, but keeping layers for eggs can be more valuable over the long run than cooking them as a regular protein. Eggs also store better than fresh meat for a short period and can be cooked quickly, which fits busy routines. They can be boiled for travel, set into simple dishes, or used to enrich grain foods without requiring a full slaughter. This is one more example of how daily diets favor foods that keep and repeat. Wild game was more strongly tied to status and opportunity than to the everyday calorie base. Hunting requires time, weapons, and access to land, and success is uncertain, so game can function as a luxury even when it is locally available. Ancient writers mention hare and other game animals, and hunting scenes appear in art, often associated with leisure rather than with basic survival. When game does appear in meals, it often carries social meaning, signaling skill, privilege, or hospitality. A gift of game can also display access and competence because it suggests spare time and reliable tools. That makes it a different category from staple foods, which are valued for predictability rather than prestige. Beef was generally less common because cattle were valuable as work animals, helping plow fields and move loads, and that utility can outweigh the value of their meat. In an economy where labor is precious, slaughtering a strong ox can cost future harvests, not just tomorrow's dinner. Cattle also require more feed and water than goats or sheep, so they can be harder to keep in large numbers on rugged land. This combination helps explain why beef can appear as a notable or special food rather than a routine one. Even when a household owns a beast, its daily work in the fields can matter more than eating it. Meat choices follow the same logic as everything else. Keep what keeps producing. With meat's place clarified, it becomes natural to return to what filled most bowls most days: legumes and vegetables, and the ways they provided steady nourishment without the expense of slaughter. Beans and lentils store well, simmer into thick filling dishes, and accept oil, herbs, and salt in small amounts that make them satisfying. Vegetables and wild greens expand the plate when they are available, and dried foods keep the table stable when they are not. These foods also fit the rhythm of the year because a household can dry, store, and portion them without losing the source. Once you see that pattern, the everyday diet looks less like a list of missing luxuries and more like a practical system built to repeat. Legumes mattered because they supply protein in a form that stores dry, travels well, and feeds many people without requiring pasture or slaughter. Lentils, chickpeas, and broad beans appear repeatedly in Greek food discussions because a sack of dried pulses can sit for months and still become a filling meal with only water, salt, and thyme. In everyday terms, a handful of beans can turn into a bowl that feels substantial, especially when paired with bread and a little oil. Dried legumes also fit a storage-minded year. After harvest, they can be dried, kept in jars or sacks, and portioned little by little without spoiling the rest. They tolerate transport better than tender greens and far better than fresh meat, so they can move from farm to town or from port to inland market without being defeated by a single hot afternoon. When a household can count on pulses, the diet has a steady center that does not depend on luck. Soaking dried legumes is less about tradition and more about how dryness behaves. Dry beans are built to resist water until time softens their structure. A long soak loosens the skin and lets water move toward the center, which shortens cooking time and helps the beans cook more evenly. It also saves fuel, a quiet advantage when wood or charcoal has to be gathered, carried, and watched. Soaking has another practical benefit. It makes it easier to sort out stones, broken pieces, and dust before the pot goes on the fire, and it gives a cook a chance to discard any beans that look damaged. Some legumes cook well without soaking, especially smaller lentils, but the general habit still helps the kitchen run predictably. Once the beans have had time to drink, the next question is not whether they will soften, but what kind of meal they will become. Boiling legumes into thick soups and porridges is efficient because one pot can cook a large batch with little attention once it reaches a steady simmer. A cook can bring the pot up, skim any foam, then let time do the work while other tasks continue. Soups accept whatever is available: onions, herbs, greens, or a small amount of fish or cheese without needing separate dishes or complicated timing. A bean soup can be stretched with grain or with pieces of bread, turning one pot into multiple meals across a day, which fits households that cook once and eat more than once. In plain terms, soup turns a pantry into something warm and complete. The liquid carries salt and oil through every spoonful, and the thickened broth makes a small portion feel satisfying. When the pot is steady, the flavor base starts to matter because it lifts the whole batch at once. Onions, garlic, and leeks are foundational because they store better than tender vegetables and make simple foods taste deeper. They can be kept for days or weeks in dry conditions, and a small amount can change the smell and taste of a stew without requiring expensive additions. Their strong flavor stands up to long cooking, which matters when beans need time to soften, and it can brighten a pot when the rest is built from mild staples. These alliums can be chopped and cooked slowly in oil to start a stew, or they can be added later for a sharper edge. They also work outside the pot. A raw onion with a pinch of salt or a clove of garlic rubbed on bread can make a plain meal feel finished with almost no extra cost. Once this foundation is common, greens and vegetables become easier to rotate without making meals feel repetitive. Leafy greens in ancient diets often came from both gardens and foraging, though as a modern note, foraging is only for people who can identify plants with a reliable guide, because many edible plants grow wild where people walk, graze animals, and farm. Bitter greens like chicory and mustard types can be gathered seasonally, though the exact leaves eaten would vary by place and local knowledge. One simple pattern is to boil greens until tender and then dress them with oil and vinegar. Heat softens bitterness, and the dressing adds richness and brightness with only 2 pantry items. Cooked greens also become easier to chew and easier to combine with other foods. Once dressed, they pair naturally with bread, because bread can soak up the oil and vinegar that carry flavor. Greens can also be stirred into soups near the end, where they soften quickly and stretch the pot. In a diet built on stored staples, a handful of greens is not decoration. It is a practical way to add freshness and variety. Alongside wild greens, small gardens could add fresh contrast where water and sheltered soil allow plots to thrive. Crisp vegetables like lettuce, cucumbers, and radishes offer relief from the softer textures of beans and porridge, and many can be eaten raw or with minimal preparation, making them useful when fuel is limited or time is short. Even a small garden can diversify meals without changing the basic pantry, because a few plants can turn a plain bowl into one with crunch and coolness. Vegetables that keep longer also matter, because they turn harvest into planning. cabbage, and similar sturdy plants can sit longer than delicate leaves, and they can be eaten raw when tender, then boiled or stewed as they mature. Some households could preserve vegetables by salting them, storing them in brine, or letting them turn pleasantly sour over time, which extends their usefulness beyond the harvest window. The exact methods vary, but the logic stays the same. A vegetable that keeps becomes part of the calendar, not just the market. Roots such as turnips and other storage-friendly vegetables are valuable because they hold energy in a dense form and can be stored longer than delicate greens. Roots can be boiled, roasted, or sliced into stews, and their sweetness becomes more noticeable with heat as flavors concentrate. A root vegetable can anchor a pot when meat is absent, adding body and substance to soups built from beans and grain. Stored roots also give a cook something solid to cut and portion when the garden is thin, which matters late in the season or during dry spells. Some roots come with useful greens as well, and those tops can be cooked like other leafy vegetables instead of being discarded. The more a vegetable keeps, the more it behaves like a staple. It becomes something a household expects to have, not something it hopes to find. Acid and all together form a quiet seasoning system because vinegar brightens while oil rounds and carries aroma. Vinegar can come from wine turning sour, and once a household has it, it becomes useful for dressings, quick pickling, and balancing richer foods like cheese. Oil helps herbs cling to leaves and sliced vegetables and makes each bite feel more consistent. When oil and vinegar are shaken together, they briefly blend and coat food instead of sliding off, which is useful when the meal is mostly bread, beans, and greens. Acid can also wake up legumes, cutting through their heaviness and making leftovers taste new the next day. These small levers matter because they do not require rare spices. They rely on common, durable ingredients that can be used drop by drop. The central idea of vegetables and legumes in ancient Greek eating is that they provide steady nourishment with predictable storage, not dramatic spectacle. Beans and greens can meet daily needs more reliably than occasional meat, and they adapt to whatever else is on hand: bread, oil, fish, or cheese. They also scale because a pot of pulses can feed a large household or a small one with the same method, just adjusted amounts. Vegetables work the same way. A handful of onions can flavor a cauldron. A pinch of chopped greens can stretch it, and a splash of vinegar can sharpen it without changing the structure of the meal. When the base is stable, variety comes from small changes in seasoning, timing, and what is available that week. With the plant backbone clear, it becomes natural to look at the small but powerful ingredients that shaped flavor every day: herbs, salt, vinegar, and honey. Herbs were an everyday way to create variety because they grow readily in Mediterranean climates and can be used fresh or dried. Plants like oregano, thyme, mint, dill, and coriander can add strong flavor with a small pinch, which matters when most meals are built from grains, beans, and greens that need lift. Fresh leaves can be chopped into a pot near the end so their scent stays lively, or scattered over a bowl right before eating. A cook can bruise herbs between the fingers to release fragrance before they touch warm food. Herbs also fit the rhythm of walking and gathering. A few stems picked on the way home can become the difference between a plain bowl and a finished one. When seasonings are light but consistent, the same lentil soup can taste different just by changing which herb leads. Drying herbs concentrates aroma and makes them portable, turning a hillside plant into a pantry ingredient that can last through winter. Bundles can be hung in shade and moving air. Then leaves can be crumbled into jars or small sacks that stay ready for weeks. Dry herbs are useful because they do not demand timing. They can be added early to steep through a simmer, or added late for a sharper edge. Even when a meal is mostly barley, beans, and greens, a pinch of dried thyme or mint can make the bowl feel new, without changing the main ingredients at all. Despite the word spice sounding like luxury, many seasonings in Greek cooking were local rather than imported. Bay leaves, fennel, wild thyme, and other hardy aromatics can be gathered or grown, and their flavors stay recognizable even when used in small amounts. A household does not need rare powders to make food taste finished. It needs dependable plants and a habit of using them well. A leaf dropped into a simmering pot or a pinch rubbed into oil can season the whole meal because heat and fat carry aroma. Imported seasonings did exist through trade, but they would not be the daily default for most kitchens. So it is safer to picture Greek flavor as herb-forward, with occasional special additions when available. This helps explain why many descriptions emphasize balance, because strong local plants can do a lot without overwhelming the base foods. Salt is both seasoning and preservation, and those two roles are linked in a world without refrigeration. Coastal salt can be made by evaporating seawater in shallow pools, and inland sources can come from mineral deposits, so access varies by geography and trade. A small amount of salt makes bread, beans, and vegetables taste complete, but larger amounts are what allow fish, olives, and cheese to last through warm months. Salt also affects texture, drawing moisture out of sliced vegetables and firming proteins in fish and meat. In practice, salt becomes something a household plans around. It is measured by pinches and handfuls, and it is stored carefully because it supports the whole pantry. When one ingredient changes both taste and shelf life, it becomes a basic tool, not a luxury. Vinegar is essentially soured wine, and it becomes useful because acidity slows spoilage and brightens plain foods at the same time. Vinegar can be used in dressings with oil, added to stews to cut richness, or used in quick pickles that keep vegetables edible for longer than they would stay fresh. Acidity pairs well with fish and bitter greens since it sharpens flavor and makes heavier meals feel lighter. It can also wake up legumes, especially when a pot has simmered long enough to taste soft and starchy. A splash near the end can make the whole pot taste clearer. Vinegar is also a natural side road because some wine will sour, and a careful household can turn that change into a helpful seasoning. Honey was a primary sweetener in ancient Greece because refined sugar was not a standard everyday ingredient in that time and place. Honey stores well, and its sweetness is concentrated, so a little can change a whole dish, especially when paired with dairy, fruit, or nuts. It can be mixed into drinks, stirred into sauces, or used to sweeten simple cakes for special days, adding flavor and energy without needing a separate crop like sugarcane. Because honey is stable and portable, it fits the same logic as oil and dried fruit: small volume, high value, long keeping. That combination makes honey both a treat and a practical sweetener that can be saved, measured, and rationed. Beekeeping in the ancient Mediterranean used simple hives, including clay cylinders, woven baskets, or hollowed logs, with designs that shelter bees while allowing harvest. The details varied by region and period, but the basic challenge stayed the same: taking honey without destroying the colony. Smoke is often mentioned across beekeeping traditions because it calms bees by disrupting alarm signals and encouraging them to focus on feeding rather than defense. Harvest timing matters too, since taking too much late in the season can weaken the hive when flowers fade. Careful keeping turns sweetness into something renewable. Wax and comb can also be useful materials, so the hive can support more than one household need. When beekeeping is done carefully, honey becomes a renewable store of sweetness rather than a one-time raid on a wild nest. Honey and cheese are a classic pairing because salt and sweetness balance each other, and both foods are dense sources of calories. A small piece of brined cheese with a drizzle of honey can feel like a complete bite, combining fat, protein, and sugar in a way that satisfies quickly. Honey also works well with bread, either as a topping or mixed into simple cakes, since it browns and adds moisture. In a pantry meal, that matters, because a little honey can soften coarse bread and make it feel fresher. These combinations are also portable, which matters for shepherd life and for anyone moving between fields, villages, and markets with limited time to cook. When sweetness is limited, pairings like this become memorable because they place strong flavor into a small portion. Herbs can also move into oils and wines, creating flavored bases that keep longer than fresh leaves. Steeping thyme, oregano, or other aromatics in oil infuses fragrance that can be added in a measured way, which is useful when fresh herbs are out of season. Oil carries aroma well, and a small spoonful can spread scent through a whole bowl of beans or a plate of greens, so flavor becomes something you can store. Similar ideas apply to wine, where honey or herbs can create a drink that tastes distinct. A bit of sweetness or a hint of aromatic plant can make a young wine feel more rounded. These are not extravagant techniques. They are small adjustments that use thyme and fat as flavor carriers. Greek writers sometimes describe garlic and onions as foods with health benefits, though ancient medical ideas do not map neatly onto modern science. What is stable is that these pungent plants were valued for being reliable, strong-tasting, and easy to store, so they naturally became part of daily cooking. Their sharpness can wake up a pot of beans or greens the same way vinegar does, and a few cloves can make plain bread and oil feel like a real meal. When a food is common and noticeable, people attach meanings to it, from strength to stamina to protection. And those meanings can show up in jokes, advice, and folk habits. It is safer to treat these as cultural beliefs rather than guaranteed outcomes. But the beliefs themselves show how deeply small flavor ingredients were woven into daily life. With the seasonings in place, the next natural step is to look at the foods that deliver sweetness and crunch without much cooking, fruits and nuts, and how they were kept through the year. Figs were a major fruit in the Greek world because they grow well in warm climates and offer a lot of sweetness for the space they take. Fresh figs are delicate and seasonal, but they dry effectively, and drying concentrates sugars while reducing water that would otherwise invite spoilage. In practical terms, a dried fig is a compact piece of stored summer, easy to carry and easy to portion, which makes it useful for workdays, travel, and winter food stores. Drying also makes the fruit tougher, so it can be stacked and handled with less bruising, and a few pieces can be rehydrated later in a little water or wine if a cook wants them softer. When a fruit can be preserved with a simple method, it becomes a staple rather than a brief luxury. Drying fruit is a preservation method that turns time into sweetness because water, leaves, and flavors become denser. Grapes becoming raisins is a clear example. A bunch of grapes can shrink into a small handful that lasts far longer and still tastes rich. Dried fruit also resists bruising better than fresh fruit, which means it travels more safely by foot, cart, or ship. It can be stored in jars, baskets, or cloth sacks with less loss, as long as it stays dry and protected from insects. The work of drying is slow and simple. Spreading fruit in the sun, turning it, and keeping it airy so it does not sour or mold. This is why dried fruit so often sits beside bread and cheese, acting like a pantry food instead of a fragile produce item. Grapes mattered in multiple forms because they could be eaten fresh, dried, or fermented, and each form fits a different season and need. Fresh grapes are a quick pleasure when harvest is near, and they also offer moisture in a hot climate. Raisins are portable energy that can be eaten in handfuls, folded into grain dishes, or carried for long walks without special care. Wine is a stored drink that can be rationed across months, mixed with water as needed, and carried in durable containers. Using the same crop in 3 ways reduces risk, because a household can decide whether to eat grapes now, dry them for later, or press them depending on weather, labor, and storage space. That flexibility is one reason vineyards can support local economies, not just a season of snacking. Pomegranates make sense at the table because they offer both sharpness and sweetness protected inside a firm rind. Their structure makes them less fragile than many soft fruits, which helps them survive transport and stay usable for a longer window after harvest. They can be eaten fresh, scattered over dishes for tart bursts, or pressed into juice that brings acidity and color. A fruit like this helps a simple meal feel balanced. It can brighten rich foods like cheese and oil, and it can wake up plain staples like bread or a bowl of beans with a few sour, juicy seeds. When a pantry leans on stored foods, sharp fruit becomes a simple way to add contrast without complicated seasoning. Apples and pears existed in the broader Greek world, though their availability depended on region, trade, and season. In cooler or higher areas, these fruits can grow more reliably than in the hottest, driest zones, and geography shapes who sees them often. Fruit can be eaten fresh when it is at its best, but cooking fruit is another form of planning. Heat softens texture, and honey supplies sweetness without requiring refined sugar, turning a firm bite into something gentler. Quinces are especially notable because they can be too firm and astringent to enjoy raw, yet become fragrant and tender when cooked. This is a practical reminder that not all fruit is meant for immediate eating. Some fruit is meant for transformation, the same patient logic that turns grapes into wine and figs into long keeping stores. Nuts are valuable because they store well when kept dry and provide dense calories in a small handful. Almonds, walnuts, and hazelnuts can be eaten raw or roasted, and roasting drives off moisture and deepens flavor while also helping storage. Nuts pair naturally with dried fruit because the textures contrast and the calories add up quickly, making a small serving feel substantial. In a world where food must often be carried, nuts behave like concentrated fuel that does not spoil fast. They can sit in a pouch or jar without much attention, which matters when fuel is limited or when the day is already crowded with work. When chopped or ground, nuts can also thicken sauces and add richness to grains without needing extra cooking steps. Once nuts are common, They can shift from snack to ingredient with almost no change in tools. Grinding nuts into pastes is a way to turn hard, dry food into spreadable richness that can stretch other staples. A paste can be mixed with honey for sweetness, stirred into porridge for body, or used as a filling, and it adds fat that makes a meal feel more satisfying. The same stone tools used for grain can also reduce nuts, though the work is slower and the reward is dense. In simple terms, a nut paste acts like a portable sauce. It carries flavor and energy and can be added in small amounts, which makes it easy to ration. When rich additions come in paste form, a household can turn a plain bowl into something fuller with just a spoonful, and that makes the pantry feel more flexible across the year. Despite the modern habit of expecting dessert at the end, ancient sweet eating was often built from fruit, honey, and nuts rather than from elaborate baked sweets. That does not mean cakes and pastries did not exist, but it does mean everyday sweetness could be as simple as a handful of raisins, a piece of dried fig, or cheese with honey. These foods require little preparation, and they rely on ingredients that keep well, which makes them suitable for regular life rather than rare celebration only. When sweetness is limited, these combinations become memorable because they concentrate pleasure into small portions. A little sweet beside a little salt can feel complete, and that balance is part of why fruit, nuts, and honey show up so often as quiet rewards at the edge of an ordinary meal. Sweetness could also be concentrated from grapes themselves, adding another tool to the pantry. Grape must, the fresh juice of crushed grapes, can be reduced by heating into a thicker syrup that keeps longer and tastes intensely sweet. The basic idea is evaporation. Water boils away and sugars concentrate, creating a sweetener that can flavor foods without relying only on honey. A thick syrup is easy to transport and portion, and it can be stirred into porridge, brushed onto bread, or used to sweeten drinks in small amounts. Similar reduced syrups appear around the Mediterranean in different traditions, which makes sense wherever grapes are abundant and storage matters. Dates could arrive in Greek markets through trade from warmer regions to the east and south, and their presence points to connections as much as to taste. Because dates dry naturally on the tree and store well, they travel better than many fruits, arriving as dense sweetness that can be eaten as is. Imported foods can also signal status, since transport costs money and reliable access depends on steady market links. Even a small handful of dates can feel special when most local sweetness comes from honey, raisins, and dried figs, and that contrast can make imported fruit feel like a quiet signal of wealth or hospitality. With fruits and nuts mapped as stored sweetness and portable energy, it becomes natural to gather the whole picture of daily meals, tools, and cooking methods as we move toward a calm close. Ancient Greek cooking relied on live heat, usually from wood or charcoal, so technique was often about controlling coals rather than setting exact temperatures. Charcoal burns more evenly than raw wood once it is established, which makes it useful for steady cooking like simmering and grilling, while a wood fire is useful for building heat quickly and making a bed of embers. Without thermostats, cooks judged heat by distance, time, and the way food behaved. They learned how far a pot should sit from the hottest center, when to pull it to the edge, and when to spread coals thinner to calm a boil. A quick rake of embers can change a pan from fierce to gentle in seconds, and a small pile banked to one side can keep warmth ready for the next pot. This is why many everyday foods favor forgiving methods. because reliable results matter more than precision when fuel and heat are variable. Clay and bronze pots made boiling and stewing practical. And those methods are efficient because water spreads heat evenly and protects food from scorching. A pot of beans, greens, and grain can cook slowly with little attention once it reaches a gentle simmer, turning a small fire into many portions. Covered cooking reduces evaporation, saving both water and fuel, and it keeps aromas in the pot, which helps plain ingredients taste fuller without adding much else. A lid also softens heat swings, so a cook can step away and return without finding the bottom burned. Some vessels could be set on stones, nestled into ash, or hung over the fire, and each setup is another way to tame heat without measuring it. When pots do the heavy lifting, one tool can support many different meals across a week. Portable braziers, essentially small charcoal stoves, provided flexible heat and could be moved to suit space and weather. A brazier holds coals in a contained bed, making it easier to grill, warm flat breads, heat small pots, or keep food warm without tending a large open fire. This kind of portable heat suits urban life, where some homes had limited room for a full hearth and cooking needed to fit into sheltered corners or shared courtyards. A brazier can be shifted out of the wind, moved into shade, or pulled closer for careful tasks like warming wine or reheating a bowl of stew. It also helps with pacing because you can feed it a little charcoal and hold a steady level of heat instead of constantly rebuilding a fire. Baking and roasting often depended on retained heat, using clay ovens, covered pots, or domed covers that trap hot air and radiant warmth. A common logic is to heat the chamber or the cover first, then let stored heat bake bread or roast food with less active fueling. This approach is fuel smart because it uses a burst of fire to charge the oven, then cooks steadily as the heat slowly declines. In some methods, hot coals are placed around a cover, and sometimes a few are placed on top, so heat comes from above and below at once. Roasting can follow the same idea, with food set near embers and turned as needed rather than held in direct flame. When retained heat is the plan, timing becomes a skill, and timing is what turns simple dough into reliable bread. Daily meals are often described as 3 main eating times, with a light morning bite, a modest midday meal, and a larger evening meal. Breakfast could be simple, often bread, sometimes softened by dipping in wine, or paired with olives or fruit, since quick foods fit the early hours. The midday meal was commonly small and practical, meant to sustain work rather than become a long social event. A midday bite might be bread with onions, a few dried figs, or whatever was easy to carry in a pouch. Evening offered more time for a warm pot of food, cooked vegetables, or a fuller spread of what the household had stored. The rhythm makes sense when daylight and labor decide when a fire is easiest to tend. The evening meal was often the main hot meal because it is easier to manage a fire and a pot when work is slowing and people are gathered. Ancient references use terms like deipnon for the main meal, though usage can shift across time and place, so it is best treated as a common label rather than a strict schedule rule. A main evening dish might be a stew of legumes, a grain porridge, cooked greens dressed with oil and vinegar, or fish when available. Bread served as both food and support, helping scoop, pinch, and stretch small flavorful items across more bites. When one meal is larger, a household can combine ingredients and make leftovers, which saves fuel the next day. In a pantry economy, continuity matters, and a pot that feeds twice is a quiet kind of success. Eating with the hands was normal in many settings, especially for bread-based meals where pieces can pinch, scoop, and wipe. Bread can gather sauces and soft foods, making it a practical utensil that also becomes part of the meal, reducing the need for specialized tools. Spoons existed and were useful for soups and porridges, and knives were common for cutting bread, fruit, and cooked meat. Forks were not a standard everyday table utensil in this context, so the hand, the spoon, and the bread itself did much of the work. Shared dishes and simple bowls fit this style of eating because people can portion by tearing, dipping, and passing food along. The tools are simple, so the foods often are too, with textures meant to be lifted and shared. Hand washing before and after meals carried both hygiene and hospitality meaning because clean hands matter when people share food and eat with fingers. Water might be poured from a jug over a basin for guests, and offering this rinse signals welcome and good order, the same way offering bread and wine does. Clean habits also help stored foods last, since dirty hands can spoil a brine, taint a jar, or carry unwanted sourness from one batch to the next. In practical terms, washing is a small routine with a large payoff when preservation depends on keeping microbes out of the pantry. Even a quick rinse and a cloth to dry can make shared eating feel comfortable, orderly, and respectful. After dinner, drinking gatherings, often described as symposia, use diluted wine as a paced social practice with its own rules. Conversation, music, and games were part of the structure, and the chosen strength of the mix helped keep the tone steady rather than chaotic. Many accounts mention a leader who set the ratio and the pace of rounds, turning drinking into something managed rather than rushed. Wine and water could be mixed in a large bowl, then served out so the group shared one standard of strength. Not every household hosted a symposium, and the practice is more visible in elite settings, but it shows how food and drink could shape social life, not just satisfy hunger. Even here, the theme is moderation, with the cup moving in measured steps. If you step back, the pattern that holds ancient Greek food together is the triad of grains, olive oil, and wine, supported by legumes, vegetables, fruit, and occasional animal foods. The cuisine is not built on endless ingredients. It is built on a few dependable ones used with good storage habits, careful pacing, and small flavor levers like herbs, vinegar, and honey. That is why the same pantry can produce many different meals across a year, even when seasons and markets shift. Thank you for listening, and may your night feel quiet, steady, and deeply restful. Good night.